Hello and welcome to the Club Development Scotland podcast. In this week's podcast, we're speaking to Stuart Haw, a PhD student looking at community asset transfers in the sports sector. Community asset transfers are something you might be familiar with, but equally you might just be hearing about them for the first time. So, in short, community asset transfers are an opportunity for community groups, the vast majority of sports clubs included, to have a greater say in the running and ownership of community facilities. This can be hugely empowering to a sports club and brings a range of benefits, including community, social and financial benefits. And community asset transfers could become increasingly more relevant to sports organisations. Some recent research suggests that the impact of COVID-19 will mean many community facilities in Scotland will never reopen. According to a recent survey of public operators, around 116 public sports, leisure and cultural facilities across Scotland, including 18 leisure centres and 8 swimming pools, are facing permanent closure as a result of lockdown. And the research also suggests another further 900 facilities might not reopen for a considerable length of time following lockdown as well. So this presents a huge threat to our facilities in Scotland, and but it also does create an opportunity for sports organisations, and this is where community asset transfers might be relevant. So we speak to Stuart about what the process looks like for community organisations that are interested in the process, what kind of skill sets a club would need to undertake a community asset transfer, and what some examples of best practice look like in Scotland. So without further ado, here's Stuart Haw talking about community asset transfers. So, Stuart, thank you very much for joining us on the Club Development Scotland podcast. I wondered if we could start off by just briefly talking about what community asset transfers are, often sort of abbreviated to CATs, and they're things that lots of clubs probably will have heard of. But I wondered if you could give us a bit of a basic overview of what they are and what the purpose and intention of community asset transfers are.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me on. It's great to share some research and thoughts with clubs across Scotland. So CATs, they are a transfer of a facility from a local authority. So that could be a parish council, a county council, or a likewise council, to a community organisation. So that could be a sports club, but it could also be a social enterprise, a community interest company, or any other charitable body. And the transfer is premised on there being a peppercorn rent. So it could be as low as 1 penny a year. And the idea of that is that the organisation operating the facility is to provide some form of social value and community return from that transfer. So it should benefit the community that they run that facility.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned there, so it could be a sports club, it could be a community interest company. Who can actually undertake that process? What are some of the kind of key features that any organisation that goes through that process would need to have?
Any registered not-for-profit organisation can undertake that. And what's interesting is where organisations that aren't primarily sport or leisure organisations do take on sport and leisure facilities, often that can be because they've associated together out of a desire to stop a facility closing. So it may be in a deprived area or a relatively deprived area where the council has had reductions in its budget. Because sport and leisure is discretionary, those services and facilities are often the first to be cut. So when that occurs, facilities that are loss-making, that aren't necessarily attractive to big national providers, big leisure trusts, they risk being closed. So often groups associate to stop them being closed. So it's not necessarily just sports clubs that have an interest in the CAT of sport and leisure facilities. With that said, sport clubs are also interested and do have an interest in stopping those facilities closing, especially if they are a club that use that facility. So yeah, it can happen for a variety of reasons, because sports clubs, they may also approach the council to instigate a cap. And that could be because they're sharing a facility and they want to move into another, or they're using a facility where they're paying a lease or paying another club, and they feel that they have enough members and enough service delivery to run another facility sustainably.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Something else you mentioned there, which I wanted to touch on, was on the sort of social value of it. So they need to be able to demonstrate a kind of wider social value to the community. What does that kind of look like in practice in terms of how a club would demonstrate that?
Yeah, it's a really important area of the transfer, because to have that peppercorn rent and to have that asset at their use requires them to offer something to the local community, but it needs to be needs-based. So it can't just be the service of their club or the sessions that they offer. They need to be involving community people and possibly minority or people in the area that are not well represented in that particular sport or in sport more broadly. So that could be doing things like, if they were a swimming club, women's only swim sessions, or swim sessions for community groups that are not necessarily represented in swimming as much as other groups. So it varies between localities what that social value looks like, but it really is based on what that local community needs and where there is a lack of access for community members.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And am I right in thinking, so you mentioned sort of different community groups coming together often to undertake a community asset transfer. Am I right in thinking that those types of organisations that have joined together in a bid or an approach would be more likely to succeed than just a single entity that perhaps were just more focused on their club per se?
I don't know if they would be more likely to succeed, but it is worth considering that they have associated together for the specific purpose of that facility, whereas a club that has been running for many years prior has a number of other objectives to meet. So for that club, it's a challenge to still meet the needs of its members, if they're a competitive sport club, to be still achieving performance objectives whilst now having this facility to see to, because it's worth bearing in mind the people that go into those organizations, because if people are associating together to stop a facility closing, then that's their reason for entering that organization. But often sports clubs are ran by people that are coaches of the club, parents of athletes at the club, and also former athletes of that club. So they're not necessarily people that are prepared and have a history of facility management.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Okay, that makes sense. Thank you. So I guess as well, we should also point out that community asset transfers aren't the only option when it comes to community groups getting a greater level of empowerment when it comes to facilities. So there's also the opportunity for leases and license to occupy. I wondered if you could maybe just give a little bit of background as to how each of these kind of three options differ from one another, and why a club or a group might be more inclined to go for one rather than the other.
Yeah, it is just one of a variety of ways of having a bit more freedom with the facility that they use. My main research really covers asset transfer. So in terms of what I know, the difference is that with a cap, the main benefit is that you are seen as the owner of the facility. So if you have a lease of over 25 years, then that is officially an asset transfer, based on the duration that you're running it for. And the benefit of that is that it means if other clubs and organizations use that facility, then you'll be able to generate revenue from those other clubs. But if you were just a leaseholder, the way you generate revenue would be different. And if you were just like a facility user, then you would be one of, the other organizations that are paying to use that facility. So if a club is considering going into a transfer, they really need to consider who are the other stakeholders that use that facility. How would it work in terms of usage, and who would benefit financially and in other ways from the different organizations using that facility? So all of these things need to be considered not only by the club, but the other stakeholders need to be involved in that kind of process as well.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. Thank you. So let's just touch a little bit upon some of your experiences from your own research and some of your findings so far. So you're doing your PhD research on community asset transfers within the sport and leisure industry. That, as you say, that isn't necessarily just sports clubs that are taking the process, but they are involved in it or can be involved in it. So what do we kind of know about asset transfers and sports so far in terms of, could you give us a rough estimate of how many have been undertaken or any examples that kind of stand out to you?
Yeah, definitely. A few overarching figures would be that it's definitely on the increase. So in Scotland, the history of asset transfer and asset ownership is different to the history in England because of the land reform and land ownership policies that have been implemented in Scotland. And in England, there's a localism agenda through the Localism Act and the Big Society agenda. So there are different reasons for why asset transfers have increased over time across some of the home nations. But I guess a general theme is that over time, it's increased for sport and leisure and more broadly. So it's definitely on the increase. I would say there are just over 300 sport and leisure facilities that have been transferred within the last 25 years. So it's not a massive amount, but when you consider all of the stakeholders involved in each transfer, that is quite a lot. So, quite a lot is happening. A lot of clubs are choosing this as a way of growth, a way of having more freedom in how they deliver their services. But it also indicates that a lot of local authorities are feeling a strain and are seeing this as a way of reducing the liabilities that they have, but also empowering local communities as well. So at the moment, with the impact of the pandemic and with the strain that the financial strain that local authorities are facing, it does seem likely that we will have an increase in asset transfers in the near future as well. One thing I'm exploring at the moment, and it's a very slow burning exploration, is year on year what the difference is. So I've got some data from the first year, which was last year. Now, obviously, that's not kind of useful itself to make that year on year comparison, but it does seem likely that these transfers will increase. And without that data, there is another way of sort of looking at whether they will increase, and that's with the number of local authorities that have an asset transfer policy. And that's been increasing over time. So when that was first researched, I think in 2014, it was about 20% of local authorities had an asset transfer policy, and that figure has definitely increased over time. And what is interesting with that is that it is, a clear indication of what that local authority wants to do. They want community organisations to take on facilities.
Yeah, absolutely. In terms of some the types of sport, is there one particular sport where there seems to be more transfers than others? Like football versus athletics, for example.
On the whole, there isn't, but if you were to break it down into 4 sports clubs, I think there definitely is. So there does seem to be a greater number of parish councils transferring bowls greens to local bowls clubs. I think that's quite interesting because you have to ask what is it about bowls greens that incentivizes the parish council to transfer it, but also for the club to want to take it on. They wouldn't go through that process if they couldn't identify how they would be financially sustainable. So it's definitely interesting to see. More broadly, though, often a lot of older leisure centres and swimming pools are transferred. So the reason for that is as people's physical activity and leisure behaviour changes over time, often these facilities are less profitable for local authorities. It's harder for the local authorities to compete with large-scale private providers and large-scale leisure trusts. So some of these older facilities that they have become loss-making, and at that point, the local authority starts to consider transferring them. And the challenge there is that the local authority has to tender that out to a variety of stakeholders. But for some of those larger national providers, they're not necessarily motivated to take it on because it is already loss making. So there's no incentive for them. But for the local community, they are motivated by that community value that can be offered. So yeah, all of these factors need to be considered when looking at the what's and the whys, how many and why transfers are occurring.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think you've sort of touched on what the kind of key benefits to an organisation would be in terms of sort of being more empowered with the facility itself, the opportunity to generate more income. So I wondered, and I guess we know what the benefit would be to the facility owner in the first place, which would be to potentially reduce costs. Are there any other kind of key benefits that you found within your research in terms of perhaps community cohesion or this kind of social benefit aspects that we've mentioned?
There definitely are benefits. These benefits need to be managed in terms of the expectations that will be had with the benefits. But organizations, if they kind of come together from the local community, it seems that they are more responsive to the local needs than like a large scale provider would be. And that's really important because that's how these social kind of social inclusion and social accessibility agendas are met at local level. So large scale providers, whilst they are aiming to involve local people and reach those hard to reach groups, they don't necessarily understand the nuances of localities. So having local people, possibly local councillors, local business people, local schools and universities, part of the board of these organisations, really helps to steer the organisation towards meeting those local needs. And then additionally, having a workforce at an operational level that comes from that local area creates an environment where when local people come through the doors, they're meeting people that are like them, that understand them, and they understand the local area. And these are things that are often overlooked in service provision, especially by larger providers. But in terms of sustainability, it really helps running these facilities, because if you have that connection with local people, they're more likely to keep coming back. And I think the pandemic and the lockdowns that we've had have really exposed the value of that, because for a lot of these organizations, what is going to get them through is whether local people are willing to support them continually, even though they're not able to access the facilities at the moment. And there have been instances where both the staff have gone above and beyond to make sure things are running or will be running when we're out of lockdown, but also the local people have committed to paying their membership even though they're unable to access the facility. So you cannot overstate the importance of having that local connection.
Absolutely. In terms of some of your findings and experiences so far, what would you consider to be some of the most important considerations that a club would make when considering a community asset transfer, in terms of what the objectives were for the organization, for example?
Yeah, I think regardless of whether it's a sports club or like a campaign group turned community organization, one thing that these groups tend to share is that they wish that they had known of another group or another set of people that had gone through the process prior to them. And that's really important. If local authorities can signpost people on to support in that way, the main areas are really financial capital, social capital, and human capital. And these are the kind of academic terms that cover whether people have a business plan that's sustainable, so enough coming in to sustain them through the transfer and the management thereon, but also the right people. Sports clubs, they are run by people with brilliant and varied backgrounds. Often people have, really advanced professional careers, and they volunteer at a sports club as a coach or in an administrator role. And what people in that club need to really do is think about, who do we have in this club that has a background that is going to help us. So business backgrounds as part of the process that they'll go through, and we can come on to this in more detail. The club will need to put together a comprehensive proposal and then a business plan. And I think for a lot of clubs, this can be a challenge, especially if it's a smaller club ran by one or two people that were, former coaches and athletes at the club. It can be a real challenge to get the right stuff in the plan. It might be that they have the right skills and the right background, and they have a good connection with the community, and they understand how to run the facility. But if they're unable to articulate that and illustrate that clearly, then the council aren't going to, trust them to do that. So that is a really big consideration for any club or any organization considering taking on a transfer.
Yeah, very much so. And I can imagine a lot of this process is, not a paper exercise, but there's a lot of feasibility study planning, financial planning, and as you say, having the right people with the right skill sets involved. What are some of those skill sets that a club will need? If there's a club listening to this and they're having to think about the process themselves and they're perhaps doing an audit of the board, what are some of the skills that they would need to get involved in the club to make a success of it?
Yeah, there's quite a lot really. But hopefully, if the club is governed in a, a decent way that's in line with their national governing body or in line with other members' bodies, then they should be able to see to these considerations. So at board level, they need people with a varied skill set that covers business so that they can see to those quite comprehensive business processes. So the proposal, the business plan, it would be helpful as well if people in the club had political connections. So people at the local authority, the local MP or local councillors, because that is a key relationship that they will be reliant on, not just throughout the process, but throughout running the facility afterwards as well. And I think in some of the organisations I've looked at, you can see a big difference in the experience that those organisations have when there is a lack of a relationship with the local authority and a strong relationship with the local authority. It really is that important. I think also as well, a business background in the context of being able to involve local people and create a sustainable income stream for the organization beyond the membership. So that's really important as well.
Absolutely, yeah. Quite a wide set of skills required. So in terms of the actual process itself, again, if there is a club that kind of listen to this and are quite interested, I wondered if you could give perhaps an overview of what that process looks like in terms of the legal framework, I guess.
Yeah, it's worth mentioning that these transfers occur for a number of reasons, but I guess the two main reasons are either a facility is at risk of closing and the council or the local authority put a call for tender out, or the club will contact the council and say, you know what, we're paying X amount a year for this. Why don't we run it and see what kind of value and service we can provide for the local community? So in that first instance, a call for proposals will be made. So the council will ask not just local clubs and community organisations, but national providers as well, to put a proposal in for the transfer of that facility. What's useful for the club in this instance is that they don't need to submit a fully thorough plan. They just need to be outlining who they are, what they do, who's in what role at the club, how they provide social value, how they are sustainable as a business. And at that point, the council will look at whether they want to proceed with that proposal. If they do proceed, the council will ask them to put together a business plan. And it's at that point where they really need to be going into detail about their financial history, their forecasts, their structure, who does what their background is, how they'll provide social value, if they have evidence of providing that social value, things like community programs, this kind of stuff. And from there, it's the level of detail that will define their success. And to get that detail right, that's why it's helpful to have that connection with the local authority. In the second instance, where the club are kind of going forward and approaching the council to see if they can acquire a facility through a CAT, that proposal stage isn't really part of the process. So they're almost going straight in with a business plan. And where you see this second instance occur most is with a parish council. So rather than a local authority at county or like a city level, it's on a more rural and smaller scale with a parish council that may have like a bowls green or a smaller leisure facility.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And is there, in one of those two instances, I imagine the kind of crisis scenario with a facility looking like it's perhaps about to disappear, they the situations which tend to have a higher success rate?
No, not necessarily. Yeah, it's hard to say whether any situation, is instrumental in the success, because the only difference really is that for those organizations formed of people locally that associate together to save that facility, the only difference between them and a sports club is that they've associated together for a different reason. They've associated together to save that facility, and that's a key difference. But it doesn't necessarily mean that they are more skilled and better equipped as people and as an organization to run that facility. People in sports clubs often have really useful and advanced professional backgrounds. They may be semi-retired and retired professionals. So just because they didn't go into that club for the purpose of managing a facility doesn't mean that they won't have a background that is really going to help them take on the facility. But it's with that consideration that you start to see where this process of asset transfer can be quite, unequal across society, because those professional backgrounds that people have in clubs are disproportionate across society. In more disadvantaged areas, the people that volunteer in organizations and sports clubs may not have the same professional skills in more affluent areas where people are retired and they've got a professional background that's more relevant. So in that sense, it can lead to disproportionate levels of success.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. No, that makes complete sense. So just finally, I wondered if there are any examples of community asset transfers that you would point to as being good practice or really interesting case studies, and whether or not some of these examples would lead to sort of any recommendations that you would give to clubs thinking about the process.
Yeah, it's worth adding a caveat that my current study is focused in England, but even despite that, I've still been working with organisations in Scotland even prior to this PhD study, and that's where I am aware of a really good case study and example of the Crags in Edinburgh, which is a basketball centre. And they've done a brilliant job of really hitting the nail on the head in terms of their social value, the value that they offer for the local community, but beyond the local community as well. So they've used their facility for a lot of community events, for like a sport hackathon, which I think is quite cool and innovative. But also they've really hit some of the key social inclusion and accessibility issues. So one key theme at the moment is mental health, and they're doing a lot of great work around mindfulness and mental health. And I think doing those programs in the right way, it needs to be an authentic and genuine attempt to meet the needs of local people, but doing it in the right way where it's clear, people understand what your purpose is how you really tick that box whilst being sustainable as a facility owning organization.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Okay. Yeah. Well, that's certainly a good case study for maybe some of the people listening to this podcast to go and check out. I agree, it's sort of a well-known club in Scotland that are seen as being very progressive and innovative. So, yeah, absolutely. Well, Stuart, I know that was only a bit of a whistle-stop tour of just some of the stuff that you've been researching over the past wee while, and we'll continue to sort of keep abreast of what you're coming up with and sort of producing going forward. But thank you very much for your time and sharing your views on community asset transfers. The research sounds fascinating, so we look forward to seeing what comes of it.
No problem at all. Yeah, thanks for having me on. If people want to see more about the research, they can look at my Twitter. It's Haw_Stuart, so HAW_STUART. And yeah, like most PhD students, I'm sort of deep in the research at the moment, but sharing what I can through there.
Absolutely. And we'll include a link to your Twitter in the program notes so people can go and give you a follow and get in touch if need be.
Cool, brilliant. Yeah, thanks for the chat. It's been interesting.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. So there we go. That was Stuart Haw talking about community asset transfers. Stuart's research on community asset transfers sounds absolutely fascinating, and if you do want to go and check him out on Twitter, I'd highly recommend you do. Even after we stopped recording, we were just talking about the kind of scarcity of research that's really around on community asset transfers, and I know that a club in Scotland that were thinking about this process would really want to try and gain as much information as they can about other clubs that have undertaken the process, what best practice looks like, what the kind of conditions for success look like. So invaluable stuff, and I'd highly recommend reaching out to Stuart if you were interested in looking at it further. So that's all for this week. We hope you enjoyed the episode. We'll be back again next week with another episode. So until then, cheers.
If you're a fan of the podcast and the other work SD Scotland does, how about signing up as a member on our Patreon page? A few pounds every month will help us to continue offering advice and helping supporters, clubs and communities across Scotland.